So session 3 and session 4, we're going to take the next 2 sessions. I think it was impossible to deal with this issue in an hour. We're going to take the next 2 sessions and devote it to identifying the great harlot. This is a subject that I've been slightly hesitant to teach on publicly because in the greater picture of what I've been teaching on and articulating, which I call the Islamic or the Middle Eastern end-time paradigm, this is sort of the final doctrine that a lot of people wonder about. And I think that when I initially present it and suggest it to people just in discussion, I think people have a real hard time sort of wrapping their head around it. But I believe that after walking through all of the information that I have here, I think that it will be at least understood why I hold to this position. Now, to be clear, I'm articulating my theory. I'm articulating my understanding, and this is one of the peripheral doctrines regarding the end times, and I don't claim any absolute understanding, but after wrestling and praying and thinking through these things for some years now, I really believe that the interpretation and the identification of the great harlot, Mystery Babylon, is in keeping with what the Bible is pointing us to. So, session 3, identifying the great harlot, this becomes fairly difficult to introduce you all to. Essentially, this revelation that finds itself in primarily in Revelation 17 and 18, it begins with a prophecy in Daniel 7, and that prophecy is regarding 4 gruesome beasts. But these beasts are symbols. They're apocalyptic symbols that are used to portray 4 world empires. And then later in Revelation 13, that same motif is picked up, this motif of a beast as an empire, and then later it's picked up again in Revelation 17. So the Bible is progressive revelation. It offers us progressive revelation. It begins with some information, and then it adds to and expands on that information. And so this great harlot is a woman that by the time that we get to Revelation 17 is portrayed as sitting on and riding this beast. And so it's all fairly complicated, but in brief, the beast represents the final world empire that is in essence the competitor or the enemy of the people of God in the earth. It is the satanic empire that will be the vehicle of the Antichrist and his armies. And so we have this woman that is portrayed as riding on the beast. They are rider and steed, okay? They go together. This is essential. This is the Lone Ranger and Silver, okay? They're a team. It's the great harlot and the beast. That's how the Bible portrays them. Next slide. Our information concerning the harlot, or Mystery Babylon, these are primarily found in just a few key passages. As I just mentioned, Revelation 17 and 18 is where we have the fullest and most complete revelation of the woman. But again, and I make this point over and over again, the book of Revelation is a book that is thoroughly founded on previous revelation. It is the prophetic, poetic crescendo. It's a symphony of all of the prophetic passages throughout the Old Testament. And so when we're introduced to this woman, we have to understand that she does find her foundation in previous revelation. And some of those specific revelations are found in Isaiah 15 as well as Jeremiah 50. And then we're going to look in some detail at a verse in 1 Peter 5:13. But these revelations concerning the harlot in Isaiah 15 and Jeremiah, these are passages which have both historical as well as ultimate end-time fulfillment. So there was an entity in history known as Babylon, and these prophets were speaking to that entity, but again, they were prophesying through these historical realities and entities and speaking to this entity at the end of the age that we're going to talk about today that the Bible calls the great harlot, the great whore, or Mystery Babylon. So next slide. What we're going to do in this first session is we're going to examine the scriptural descriptions of the harlot, because there have been various interpretations and ideas offered by various believers down through history and throughout the church regarding the identity of this entity known as the Great Harlot. And I believe it's essential, again, being people who understand the times, who understand what this book, what the Bible is pointing us to. I believe that it's important that we understand these things in order that we can truly understand the times, understand the world that we live in, and all of the ramifications that come with that. But I believe it's essential that as we try to identify this woman, we walk through the various scriptural criteria, the various scriptural descriptions of the woman, and here's the key, is that whatever entity we arrive at and determine and examine as the fulfillment of this fairly mysterious prophecy, she needs to meet all of the scriptural criteria. Because some of the various ideas that have been suggested, they line up pretty strongly with a few of the descriptions, but then a few others they don't. Again, in order to fulfill the biblical criteria, it needs to line up with all of the biblical descriptions, not just a few. So next slide. The first biblical description that we're given is that this entity, this woman that is portrayed as riding on the beast, and the beast is rising up out of the sea, is that she lives in a desert. This entity specifically exists geographically in a literal desert. Revelation 17, verses 1 through 3. We'll actually read these verses a few times. Come, this is an angel. The angel is speaking to the Apostle John, the author of the book of Revelation. And, John's having all of these visionary and spiritual experiences, and there's a sort of an angelic guide that is guiding him through all of this. And the angel says, come, I will show you the judgment that is about to come upon the great harlot who sits on many waters. Consistently throughout the Bible, this motif of waters is a reference to peoples and groups of peoples, tongues, tribes, and nations. She sits on many peoples with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So, and here's the key, the angel carried me away in the spirit into the desert, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. Next slide. Now, the King James translates that rather than desert as wilderness. And here's what needs to be understood, is that, first of all, in the Strong's, in the lexicon, in the Greek, the word there is eremos or eramon. And what it refers to is a solitary, lonely, desolated wasteland, an uninhabited place. But again, this is the context of these passages is the land of Israel. And in that region, some place that was desolate, it was always the desert. This reference of eremos in that context was always desert. And the reason that I want to highlight this, next slide, is because oftentimes we hear the word wilderness and we think sort of like the Northwest Territories, like Sarah Palin's backyard, okay? We think Alaska, the great northern wilderness. And yeah, those places are by and large desolate, but in the context of the Bible, that phrase, eremos, is referring specifically to a deserted desert place. When Jesus went out and did his fast at the beginning of his ministry, he went out into the desert. It was not out into a forest. Okay, it's not that there are not places with trees in the land of Israel, and particularly when you get up into Lebanon and so forth, but this reference biblically is literally to a desert. And this is important because the woman is portrayed in a desert. This is not just sort of an irrelevant fact that we can overlook. He says, come, I will show you the woman, and there she is sitting in a desert. Next slide. And this is really essential, it's foundational because it's repeated multiple times. She is royalty. She is portrayed as a queen. Revelation 17, verse 4, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet. These are colors that in those times represented royalty. In Revelation 18, verse 7, she says in her heart, I sit as queen, and I am no widow. She is portrayed, her description is she is both a queen and a prostitute. Okay, in terms of the symbolism that is used by the Lord to convey this reality, she is both a queen and a prostitute. And by prostitute, what we're talking about, again, biblical symbolism, is, next slide, she is both a powerful religious and economic influence in the earth. And the key there with the religious influence in the earth is that biblically, fornication, spiritual fornication, is when someone worships, it's idolatry. It's when someone worships or devotes their worship to someone other than their Maker, the one true God, the God of Israel. And a lot of people say, well, this means that she is an apostate. In other words, she was once faithful, she was once married or committed, and then she committed adultery. But the word there is not the word used for adultery, but the word used in general for fornication. Okay, because biblically speaking, if you're a pagan, you're still committing adultery. You're still committing spiritual fornication. If you're not worshiping the one true God of the Bible, the God of your creation, then you are committing spiritual fornication with idols, with false gods. So she is both a powerful religious and economic influence in the earth. Revelation 17, verses 1 through 2. Again, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot. She has influence. She sits on many peoples, on many waters. And then the kings of the earth, the leaders and the rulers of the earth, have committed fornication with her. There is an immoral relationship, and through her influence, she has caused the kings of the earth, the rulers of the earth, to engage in idolatry with her. And the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. The peoples of the earth are drunk with her religious, corrupt, unbiblical religious influence. Next slide. Revelation 18, verse 3. The kings of the earth, this is repeated over and over, the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. So, she is a consumer. She is an entity that through her purchasing, she makes the merchants of the earth rich. Okay? She is a wealthy entity that causes peoples of the earth to become rich financially, and she spreads her false religious influence in the earth as well. She is guilty for the death of the saints. Revelation 17, verse 6. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the holy ones of God, and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. She is guilty, she is responsible for the death, for the shed blood of the holy ones, the people of God, which would be Israel, as well as her children, which are in essence the Christians, the followers of Jesus. The holy people of God, she is responsible for their death. Revelation 18, verse 24. In her was found the blood of prophets and holy ones, saints, and of all who are slain in the earth. She is responsible for a great amount of bloodshed in the earth. This is, it's almost like, what's that party game? Like Who Done It? You know, we lay out all the criteria and everyone's like, who is it? She lives in extravagant luxury. Next slide. Again, this is an essential description of the woman. Revelation 17, verse 4. The woman was adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She's glittering. She's covered with all sorts of expensive, precious gems and jewels and gold. Revelation 18:7. She glorified herself and lived luxuriously. This is a key defining description of the woman. She lives luxuriously. Of all of the descriptions that could be used to describe her, she lives luxuriously. And beyond this, the kings of the earth who committed fornication with her, they also lived luxuriously with her. So those that she causes to engage in her corrupt religious practices or various economic relationships, they also live luxuriously with her. Next slide. I've already covered this, but the kings, not only the kings, but also the peoples of the earth commit fornication with her. Revelation 17, 1 through 2, the great harlot sits on many waters. The kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth are actually drunk. They are intoxicated with her religious influence. And then in Revelation 18, 9, again, the kings of the earth committed fornication with her. Next slide. The beast nations will hate her. What are the beast nations? The beast nations are the nations that will make up the final empire of the Antichrist, the final coalition of the Antichrist, the union that the Antichrist will bring together. These particular nations will actually hate the woman and turn on her, and the Bible says they will devour her and burn her flesh and eat her. Okay, that's would indicate that they hate her. Revelation 17, 16 through 17, and the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these are the 10 nations that make up the final manifestation of this beast empire. These will hate the harlot. They will make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, burn her with fire, for God has put it in their hearts to fulfill His purpose. You see, God uses satanic entities down through history as His rod of judgment against whoever He chooses to do so. In the last days, God will use the surrounding Islamic nations, and whichever nations choose to join up with them, as His rod of chastisement, His final rod of chastisement against His people, not just Israel, but throughout the earth. And then after He's used them as His rod of chastisement, He breaks that rod over His knee and He judges them. But the Lord uses who He wishes as His rod of judgment. Next slide. Again, there is the map of the coming Antichrist alliances. Those are the nations that I suspect most strongly would be the primary nations that will make up the coming coalition of the Antichrist. Again, I believe that will be led by Turkey. Next slide. She represents the greatest false religion that has ever existed. Revelation 17, verse 4 through 5. And on her forehead, there's a name that is written. Every time I read this, I am taken back to high school. And I know some of you have been raised believers, but I'd say a lot of you have been there, where the buddy gets drunk and passes out, and you get out the magic marker, and you write, like, idiot. And then you're like, okay, you got to go home. Go home now. And then, they walk in the door, or whatever, moron, or, Written on her forehead is this: mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. I don't know how they fit it all on. They shrunk it down to the right font. A lot of people that read this down through history, they've read it through the lens of a Western mindset, and this is what they've concluded. They've essentially said that this woman is the mother of all harlots. In other words, she is the one that has given birth to all of the little harlots throughout the world. So she is sort of the originator of all false religions, and every false religion that's ever come along has been birthed by her. That's what's been seen here. But in fact, what we have here is a classic Eastern expression. It's not saying that she's the mother of all harlots. What it's saying is that she is the greatest harlot that has ever existed. This is classic Eastern expression. We could look at a dozen examples. When Gulf War I, when we went into the Gulf, Saddam Hussein, this is going to be the mother of all battles. The Americans are going to be strewn across the desert, right? 3 days later, they were all surrendering. It's going to be the mother of all battles. He wasn't saying this is going to be the battle that is going to give birth to thousands of battles. He's saying this is going to be the biggest, the worst, the greatest battle that has ever existed. What this verse is saying, again, talk to anybody throughout the Middle East. They go, no, it's not saying she's going to give birth to a bunch of little harlots. It's saying that she is the greatest harlot that has ever existed. What does that mean? This woman represents the greatest and most significant false religion and unbiblical, ideology that the world has ever known. She is the mother of all harlots. She is the big mama. Next slide. All nations will feel the wrath of her false religion. Revelation 18, verse 3, for all the nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her false religion, of her fornication, of her idolatry. The effects of her false religion in the earth will cause the Gentiles, all of the nations of the earth, to feel the wrath of her false religion. Next slide, Revelation 18, verse 11 through 15. She is a rabid consumer. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her after she's destroyed. Why? Because no one buys their merchandise anymore. The merchants are upset because she was a purchaser, she was a consumer. And then it goes through and it elaborates specifically on very specific products, all kinds of things, luxurious items. The merchants of these things who became rich by her, they stand at a distance, fearing her torment, her judgment, and they weep. And they say, oh, what has become of the great city? Next slide. She is portrayed as a coastal city. Revelation 18, verse 17 through 18. Every shipmaster and all who travel by the ship, okay, those on the sea, those on the ocean, as many as trade on the sea, they stood at a distance and they cried when they saw the smoke of her burning. Okay, and you can't help but think of 9/11, seeing that off in the distance across the harbor as the smoke from the World Trade Center is rising. That's the picture, is that from the ocean you can see the smoke. When she is destroyed, the smoke of her torment and her destruction is seen from a distance. I don't believe this has anything to do with New York City, but that's the picture that I envision. And they say, who is like this great city? Who is like this entity? Next slide, and this is where we're going to look at 1 Peter 5, verse 13. I believe that the key to identifying Mystery Babylon, that the key verse to identifying the great harlot is found in 1 Peter 5, verse 13. This is, again, first century, and this is sometime after the spread and the development of the church, and Peter was in Rome at the time. Now, there have been some Protestants who have said that Peter was not in Rome, and the reason is because there have been some that have seen this as a validation of the Roman Catholic idea that he was the first bishop of Rome, and they've tried to fight against that, and so they kind of go through these real strong efforts to try to say that he was not in Rome, but he was actually in Babylon. The fact of the matter is that when you look at the early documents of the church consistently, I mean, it's really not even debatable, he was in Rome. History validates that. All of the writings of the early church validate that. Babylon at the time was an absolute, just a ruin. There was nothing there. And there's no historical evidence that he was actually in Babylon. Peter was in Rome, and when he was in Rome, he said this. At the end of his epistle, he said, she, speaking of the church, who is in Babylon. Okay, Peter was in Rome, and he referred to Rome as Babylon. This is consistent with several other first century Jewish documents where the Jews referred to Rome as Babylon as well. The Syllabine oracles and a couple other sort of apocryphal, unbiblical books refer to Rome, the city of Rome, as Babylon. Peter said, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends her greetings, as does my son Mark. The early church understood Babylon as a code word for Rome at the time. Okay? In the first century, the city of Rome was viewed as Babylon by the early church, as well as the Jews of the first century. Next slide. What I derive from this is that the early church understood this phrase, Babylon, as a code word for the primary capital, the capital city of the reigning beast empire. So try to follow this. Throughout biblical history, in Revelation 17, it describes this in detail. We've had 7 biblical and historical pagan empires, a succession of historical anti-Yahvistic, anti-Christ empires that have been at enmity with the people of Israel, at enmity with God, at enmity with the church once it came along. So these empires are Assyria, and then we had, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. Okay, those are 6. After Rome came the Islamic Empire. Those are 7. And then the Bible tells us that a revived version of the 7th will come back as the 8th. It says in Revelation 17, and that will be the final manifestation of the Antichrist's geographic stronghold in the earth. Now, in the first century, try to follow this, the Roman Empire was actually Satan's physical method to persecute and come against the people of Israel. Okay, these were all empires that were anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and they all worshipped pagan gods, and they were in conflict with the God of Israel. Now, Rome was the capital of that empire. Rome was the economic and spiritual capital of the reigning anti-Christ empire in the earth. And so at enmity at the time, you had Jerusalem and Rome, God's city, Satan's city. And the church referred to Rome as Babylon. It was the Babylon of the early church. And so my thesis is this: Mystery Babylon, that phrase, Mystery Babylon, can simply be interpreted as this: spiritual Babylon. Mystery Babylon is not literal Babylon. Next slide. It was, it began, the concept of Babylon began with literal Babylon. But throughout history, as there's been this ebb and flow in the movement of these world empires, Satan's geographic stronghold in the earth has moved around. It's changed with wars and the flux and the rise of various nations. And by the first century, Rome was the new reigning capital of Satan in the earth. It was the capital of world idolatry, and it was also the economic stronghold of Satan's work in the earth. Okay? So it's the spiritual and financial power base of Satan. It's literally Satan's geographic stronghold in the earth at any given time. And again, it migrates 2 slides forward, one more back. Apologize. This is interesting from the 4th century. Tychonius, this is one of the earliest full commentaries on the book of Revelation that we have. And referring to Mystery Babylon, Tychonius says, by it, the city of the people of the devil are signified. Very, very direct, very simple. Next slide. So here you have the 7 heads of the beast. And again, the 7 heads of the beast represent the 7 empires that I spoke of down through history. So you had Egypt, Assyria, and then number 3 was Babylon. That's where the concept of Babylon began. And then by the first century, Rome was the reigning capital of Satan in the earth. It was his stronghold in the earth. Now, the next world empire that came along in the region was the 7th, the Islamic Empire. It's the only empire in world history that matches all of the criteria that the Bible lays out. And then the Bible says that the 7th will come back as an 8th. Whatever the 7th empire is, it will be revived. In Revelation 17, it gives us this riddle. It says 5 have been, 1 is, and then it says, and then the other will come, the 7th. Rome was the 6th. Those that have a Roman-centric view, they say, well, yeah, Rome was the 6th, and then Rome is the 7th, and then Rome is the 8th. And it doesn't work. It's no longer a revived Roman Empire. And then it's interesting now that the European Union, they're saying that it might break up. And so you had the rise of the Roman Empire and then the collapse again. Are we going to have it? How many times is this going to happen? The Bible is and has always been Middle Eastern centric. The Roman Empire shifts to the west, but all of these other empires were really centered in the Middle East. And the Islamic Empire meets all of the biblical criteria to match the next beast empire, if you will. Next slide. The reigning beast empire today is, in fact, the Islamic Empire. It is the greatest anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-Christ, pagan empire in the earth. Okay, the Islamic Empire. It is the greatest stronghold of Satan in the earth. Now, here's my question. What is the capital of the Islamic world? Anybody want to try to answer that? What is the capital of the Islamic world? The center of the Islamic world, the center of world idolatry, next slide, is Mecca. Nearly 1.6 billion people every day, 5 times a day, bow down and pray to ground zero in that map. And as they are doing that, make no mistake, they are worshiping Satan. Okay? They may believe that they're worshiping the one true God. It's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible did not place a shrine to himself in Mecca. 1.6 billion people, 5 times a day, are kneeling and praying to a false god. Mecca today is the world capital of idolatry. And so, next slide, the thesis of this session is that the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Mecca, as the spiritual and financial capital of the reigning beast empire of this age, is the fulfillment of this prophecy in Revelation 17 and 18. Next slide. We're going to unpack that in the next session, but before we do, what I want to do is walk through some of the other alternative possibilities, those that have been offered, one of which I really held to for some years. And I want to unpack why I believe that they do not meet all of the biblical criteria to be the fulfillment of this prophecy. So the next slide, theory number 1, and this seems to be very popular right now, is the idea that literal Babylon in Iraq will reemerge as a world and a global economic powerhouse, and that we will see the rise again of literal Babylon. And so Mystery Babylon, this great mystery down through the ages, that which is, so difficult to figure out, is actually simply literal Babylon. And if I'm to be honest, that seems incredibly anticlimactic, and I don't even understand, it doesn't make sense. Why all the hubbub about Mystery Babylon and all of these commands to discern and figure these things out? There's no mystery at all. Why not just call it Babylon? He made a point that this is Mystery Babylon. It's spiritual Babylon. It's more than just literal Babylon. The second reason why I don't believe that literal Babylon is the Mystery Babylon is because literal Babylon is simply not an economic powerhouse. Now, there was an article that was run this past year about $700,000 that was donated to rebuild the ancient city of Babylon. And in some prophecy circles, this made a big splash. And everyone's like, they're rebuilding Babylon. Babylon today is a very small tourist destination out in the desert of Iraq, where they're trying to rebuild some of the ruins of ancient Babylon where people can go and see that. But by and large, it's a small village, I think, where some of the U.S. military have been staying. But guys, $700,000, I've been involved in my own private business and doing business for various homeowners and so forth. I regularly do business with folks who live in houses that are small, that are $700,000. You can't rebuild a city with $700,000. It's like, they're rebuilding Babylon. $700,000 is not impressive. Make it, 70 billion, and then we'll have something to look at. But the bottom line is there's nothing trending in that direction at all. Nothing trending in that direction. It would have to literally arise out of the desert, in a way similar to what we've seen recently with Dubai, where they've just poured in billions to create a city, and there's really nothing there. There's no reason why they would pour billions into Babylon. Not saying it can't happen, but it sure as heck is not a possibility today, nor is it trending in that direction. Literal Babylon does not rule over the kings of the earth. There's no influence over the kings of the earth. It doesn't fulfill that criteria at all. Literal Babylon is not drunk on the blood of the saints. We could go down the list. There's really nothing to look at in Babylon other than the title, Babylon. That's really it. Anything beyond that is speculation, and there's been a lot of speculation. Anything beyond that is speculation. Next slide. Theory number 2 is that the Catholic Church, or Rome itself, is Mystery Babylon. Now, again, as I just discussed, Rome was in fact Babylon. It was. In the first century, Rome was the spiritual capital of world idolatry that was coming against Israel. but it's no longer the capital of the beast empire. In fact, the Roman Empire collapsed many years ago. The Islamic Empire conquered the last vestiges of Roman authority in Constantinople as it became Istanbul. But Rome today, and even the Catholic Church today, is a fraction as powerful as it once was. It used to be an empire. You had the Holy Roman Empire. Today, Islam has bypassed the Catholic Church in terms of numbers. There are more Muslims in the world than there are Catholics. The Catholic Church is not an economic powerhouse. Sure, they have a lot of land holdings, they have a lot of money, but they don't have so much money that they are wielding power over the kings of the earth. Yes, that may have been the case, but we are speaking of an end-time entity. We are speaking of an entity that will exist at the end of the age, that will be judged by the final beast empire just prior to the return of Christ. The Catholic Church is not what it once was. The Catholic Church is not drunk on the blood of the saints. Now, in the past, they persecuted Protestants, and they shed a lot of Protestant blood. But they have since publicly repented. Next slide. In a sermon entitled Universal Prayer, Confession of Sins and Asking for Forgiveness. Now, just let me repeat that. Confession of sins and asking for forgiveness. Pope John Paul II expressed regret and repentance over the historical sins of those Catholics who persecuted or sinned against women, Jews, gypsies, other Christians, and Catholics. That was from an article by Stephen Clone. So here's my question. Do you hold to a gospel which says that if you repent of your sins, that you'll still be punished? Or do we hold to a gospel that says that when you publicly repent, you call something sin, you say you're sorry, that you're actually forgiven? That's the gospel that I hold to. The Catholic Church, during the Reformation, so forth, persecuted a lot of Christians. But if the truth be fully known, if the Protestants had had the power, they probably would have killed as many Catholics. And in fact, there was a lot of killing that went back and forth. You know, we can pull out stuff where John Calvin had his theological enemies burnt, tortured. You know, there was a lot of nasty stuff that was going on back then. And it was primarily carried about the Catholics because they had the power. But that's not the world that I live in today. And the Catholic Church has repented. And that factor is not taken into consideration when everyone points to the fact that they're guilty of the blood of all these martyrs, and they will be punished. You know, the head of the church has repented. That has to count for something. Next slide. The Vatican does not sit in a desert. You know, I haven't personally been to Rome, but it's not what you could call a deserted, lonely place. The merchants of the earth would not see her burning, or at least not to the degree that I think that it's portraying. She's roughly 20 miles inland. And despite our differences, the Vatican does uphold the doctrines of the faith, the Trinity, the divine incarnation of God in Messiah, the cross of Yeshua. The theology of the Antichrist specifically denies all of these things. So yes, there are theological differences that we need to wrestle through, things that came up in the Reformation, and these are things that we can work through. But nevertheless, the Catholic Church does preach the cross. They do espouse the Trinity and all of the essentials of the faith. Yeah, we can wrestle about works versus faith alone and all those kind of things. But in terms of these things, there's no comparison between the Catholic Church and the brazen, direct, confrontational denial of every essential doctrine of the Christian faith in the Quran. A denial of the cross, a denial of the incarnation, a denial of the divine sonship of Christ. Okay? It's you know, apples and oranges, or what do we say? It's not apples for oranges. I mean, there's no comparison. Next slide. Theory number 3. A lot of folks have seen in the prophecy of Mystery Babylon, they've seen USA or New York City. First of all, the USA does not represent a false religion. Maybe consumerism or maybe selfishness or an egocentric mentality, but it's certainly not a false religion. The USA does not exist in a desert. The USA is not drunk on the blood of the saints. In fact, the USA has been one of the greatest missionary sending and funding entities that the world has ever known. The USA is rapidly collapsing and will likely never fully recover. I hope that's not true, but it seems to me that whenever I listen to non-optimistic, not purposely optimistic economists, it's inevitable that we have much more difficult times ahead. Next slide. Theory number 4 is that Jerusalem is Mystery Babylon. And not just Jerusalem, but in fact the religious leadership of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem itself as a city. The first problem with that, to me that's glaring, is that the Messiah comes to reign over the earth specifically, and he will rule from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. Yet, Jerusalem is the city which will bear God's name eternally. Mystery Babylon, on the other hand, it says, it's very clear, it will be utterly destroyed and it will burn forever. It says the smoke of her torment will rise forever. No longer will it be seen in her, people getting married or commerce or any of these things. It speaks of desolate place where jackals and owls dwell, and she smokes forever. Well, how does that work? If Jerusalem is going to be destroyed and burnt with fire, this is the same city where Jesus says he's going to come back and rule forever. That's a serious conflict. It's a problem. Jerusalem is not an economic or political powerhouse. Next slide. So we're going to take a break now for a few minutes, and then we're going to come back and unpack the theory of Saudi Arabia as Mystery Babylon. We're going to look at the evidence when we come back.